Here is a green ink by Visconti Green.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
This is kind of a grass green kind of a tone, maybe like a bluegrass, a rather pleasing tone in general to look at. There can be some tone variation by pen, but not all the time. And I think the tones you get are pleasing to look at. It does often shade fairly regularly. And when it does it to a very dark tone. The dark tone you're seeing now by far is the darkest tone that you will see in the video. And it isn't common of this green. So there is a solid performing green that I can totally see being enjoyed by a bunch of people. Wow, I had a whole bunch of confusing words in there. If Visconti weren't completely ignored as a brand.
The pen for today is a Retro 51 Tornado. All of the writing samples are done with
a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine, we get that nice light grass green tone that I'm talking about here. Now we get no feathering, no spread. We get great shading. Look at great on the first line. The top of the G is dark, and going into the bottom, it lightens up a bit, darkens just a hair on the R, lightens again on the EAN, very dark at the T. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the extra fine, still keeping that kind of bluegrass look to it. Let's see here, no feathering, we get no spread. As far as shading, for the most part, it's very filled out in having it. Look at filled on the second line. The top and bottom of the F are very dark. It lightens just a little bit at the I. Again, lightening at the first L, darkening on the LED through the end. Now, it does shade, and it's not a huge standout property, but I think it's doing it very well. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, with no feathering, with no spread, and towards better shading. Look at towards on the second line. It starts its way light and gradually gets to be much darker at the end of the word, right on track with where you want it to be, where when you look at track right to the left of it, right to the left, what a weird way to say it, directly to the left of it, it is lighter at the T, darker at the R, lightens at the AC, very dark at the K. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 10 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering and there is no spread. The shading is coming through in a rather intelligent kind of way. Look at intelligent on the third line. The I is a little bit darker than the N, and the TE get quite a bit darker. The L's lighten up a little bit, and it stays light until you get to the end of the G, where it gets darker, lightening at the EN and very dark at the T. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, a little bit darker than on the Clairfontaine, We get no feathering. We get no spread. We get a slow building up to some shading. Looking at building on the first line, the top of the B is lighter than the bottom of the B. It stays dark into the U, and then it lightens up all the way until the beginning of the D. Now it's the upstroke of the D that lightens, and at the ings at the end, it becomes very dark. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. We get no feathering. We get no spread. You do not have to reach very far to see much better shading here than we did on the medium. Looking at reached on the second line, the R is lighter, the E very dark, lightens up at the AC, very dark at the head at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get a little bit of ghosting, but not anything that would stop me from writing back here. Nothing bleeds through touching the page underneath.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine and a bit livelier as well. There's no feather. There is no spread. There's only little bits of shading, like the grains of wood. Looking at wooden on the first line, it's mostly one tone, but the DE get a little bit darker and the N lightens up a bit. Now, I'm not lying to you when we look at lying on the third line. That is all one tone all the way through, and that is largely what we get. Only that little bit of shading like we saw on wooden. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than we had with the extra fine. There is little bits of feathering going on. You see it in it, the very first line. You see it in standing on the first line, but not a whole lot everywhere else. It does show up on great when you get to the third line of the writing. There's no real spread. It's not horrible. I say no real because there is a tiny bit of spread. And as far as shading, it's standing on its own without having any shading. You can see it in standing on the first line. You see a slight moment of some tone variation at thick on the second line where the C lightens up just a little bit. For the most part, though, this is a solid tone. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, a little bit darker, I think, than on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread, so it did a little better there than it did with the medium in comparison. Now, when it comes to shading, it's no knee in the gut. I mean, when you look at knees on the second line, you see the K is very dark, the N lightens up, the E's get dark, but the beginning of the S lightens up, the end of the S becomes very dark. Looking at the back of the page, there's no real problem with ghosting. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath, though you do see it a little bit. I think you could write back here without a problem.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is shading, standing on the shoulders of giants, looking at shoulders on the second line. The SH are largely the same tone, but the very top of the H gets just a bit darker. It lightens up all the way till you get to the D, where it starts to darken a little bit, lightening at the ER, and then darkening again at the S. It can't be said enough that there is shading to be found in the extra fine pretty darn well, Now, if you look at said on the third line, that's largely one tone. And on this paper, that's a lot of how this looks. One tone, but there are spots that have shading. And when it does it very, very well. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, a little bit lighter than on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get some shading that is not to be laughed at. Looking at laughed on the first line, the L is very dark. The AU lighten up a bit. At the end of the U, it starts to get dark into the G. And while the G and H are very close, the H lightens up into the E. And the D becomes very dark. Nice rolling shading like we see in rolling on the second line, where the R starts a little lighter, gets darker at the top right part of the R, lightens up into the OLL, but the ING starts working its way dark again. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the medium. There is no feathering, there is no spread, and as far as shading, what do you want? It does shade what? On the first line, very dark. The do starts a little lighter and becomes darker. Now U, the beginning of the Y is lighter, but the end of the Y gets very dark through the O, and the U lightens up again. And want gradually shades from lighter to darker, left to right. Looking at the back of the page, there is no bleeding, no ghosting, perfect performance.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is a green ink by Bookbinder's Emerald Boa Snake. Here is a green ink by Diamine Magical Forest. Here is a green ink by Lamy Peridot. Here is a green ink by Organic Studios' Walt Whitman. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine, though a little bit flatter in the way it comes across. We get no feathering and we get no spread because this paper has generally done very good for fountain pens, and it is not without shading. Looking at without on the second line, the beginning of the W is dark, but then it lightens up a little bit through the end of the W and I, and the TH darken up quite a bit, OU lightening, and the T very dark again. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than we got with the extra fine, quite a bit lighter than on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering and there is no spread. Shading can be heard of here, though it is not huge. Looking at heard on the first line, it starts darker and it lightens just a little bit. It's not never there, it's just very little when it is. Look at little on the third line, where the LI are a bit lighter. The T's darken up quite a bit. The L, a little bit lighter at the top than at the bottom, and the E, very dark. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than on the Clairfontaine. We get some feathering, a little bit of bushy eyebrows here. You see it on the HY of bushy on the first line, and you see it a little bit on the bottom of the B in eyebrows. There's no real spread, and as far as the shading goes, it does occur. Look at bushy on the first line. The top of the B is lighter than the bottom of the B, and it stays dark until through the U into the S while it's lightening up. It stays lighter at the bottom of the H, but the top of the H is very dark. Light into the Y, very dark on the downstroke of the Y. And eyebrows also show some nice gentle shading, as the E is a little bit darker than the Y, and it darkens up a little bit with the E. lighter at the top of the B, darker at the bottom of the B, lightens up into the row, but at S, it starts to darken again. Looking at the back of the page, there is no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see color comparables, I prefer to see an ink that complements the color on the page. Here is an orange ink by Califolio Itsuyama. Here is a purple ink by Rohrenklinger Cassia. Here is a black ink by Noodler's X-Feather. Here is a red ink by Blackstone Uluru Red. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the Clairfontaine. We do get a tiny bit of feathering. It occurs like on the third line, or conscious on the second line. It's not painful in what's there, and the spread is it's present, but not painful again. Now, as far as shading goes, there's very little, and looking at painful on the second line, the pain is a little bit darker than the FU that occurs, but the LLE darkens just a little bit. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, lighter than on the Clairfontaine. Now, we do get some feathering and we do get some spread. You look at Gandalf and you see that it's got, kind of hazy edges to the letters. All of it is like this. The spread takes it up to about a broad, and when it comes to shading, Gandalf could not help this. Seeing Gandalf again on the first line, all one tone, and it's the same tone as everything that's there. Now, if it wasn't for the feathering and the spread of this ink, I would call it generally okay to use on 20-pound toilet paper, but it's just not that good to me here. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering and we do get spread, and I can't help but think that Gandalf's cousins, Ragnarsson, would have the same bushy eyebrows that Gandalf did, which is the reason that the name comes across with so much feathering. All of it feathers, none of it shades. All of the writing here spreads. It is not the greatest ink with anything other than an extra fine on the copy paper. Looking at the back of the page, it's fairly obvious that you can't write back here without destroying both sets of notes. However, you're not destroying that page underneath because nothing came through touching the page underneath. No bleed.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The extra fine is the lightest tone with decent enough shading, and the medium is darker than the extra fine with even more shading. The stub is almost exactly the same as the medium. So I do need to point out the broad you see now has very little shading, but is just too dark a tone for me, and possibly for most, especially when you're seeing it on this yellow paper. I think the best tone from this came from the medium flow, medium nib, and it comes with a decent amount of some good shading. A wetter pen, I think, just gets too dark for this particular green ink.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.